Hey kids, this is Ivan. How you doing? I wanted to quickly address a subject that I've alluded to a ton of times in other videos, but never really tackled directly as a subject of a video yet. I don't think I have anyway. And that's situational modifiers or tactical modifiers, specifically when the game really doesn't give you an idea of what they should be in a particular situation. And I started to think about this because I read an excellent blog post by John, the Red Dice Diaries, and he's been playing Lamentations of the Flame Princess recently, and he noted in this blog post how a game like that doesn't codify an awful lot of modifiers, and for various situations, various tactical things in the rules, where something like say 5th edition Dungeons and Dragons and various other games will do that. And he talked about just having to make up some of those modifiers on the fly, figuring out how to do that. So I just want to talk about it really briefly because I've talked to various people about this. It's part of learning a new game is figuring out well, how do I adjudicate things that might not be in the rules? And you can take games that are very exhaustive and very codified, like we'll say Pathfinder or 5th edition D&D or whatever it might be, and it starts to tell you what these modifiers are. Whereas you look at, say, a game that's a little bit more bare bones, like Lamentations of the Flame Princess, old basic D&D, that sort of thing. They didn't give you an awful lot of information. Like, if somebody gets the high ground, is there a modifier for that? What is it? Do you make it up? And so, oftentimes you find yourself in a situation, whether you're playing, a Powered by the Apocalypse game or a Fate-based game or, an old OSR game or whatever it might be, Ubiquity, where there's not a rule for this, and you think, well, how do I figure out how to make a roll here, or a modifier for a roll? And part of that, to me, there's a couple different ways you can, or tools or approaches you need to take. Or considerations, I think is the right word I'm looking for. And the first is you have to know how this particular die mechanic works and how powerful these modifiers you're going to assign to it are going to end up being. If you're using something like the 2d6 Powered by the Apocalypse roll, or the Fate roll, the 4D Fate, or some other small dice rolls, modifiers are extremely powerful. You're dealing with things like plus or minus 1, 2, and 3. By the time you get to 3, that's incredibly powerful. Whereas if you use something like a D20 based game, then plus 1, plus 2, plus 3, plus 4, they're not quite as powerful. You have a little bit more leeway, and you have to figure out, well, what do those actually do? In a game like Ubiquity, you'll notice that a lot of their modifiers tend to be, when they are codified, tend to be grouped in twos. Plus or negative 2, plus or negative 4. That's because for every 2 dice you roll, or maybe you don't roll, maybe you just take the average, that tends to give you another success. So that's part of how you figure out, well, what kind of effect is this modifier actually going to have on the chances, on the probabilities. The other consideration is you have to look at the text and figure out where they actually use modifiers and how do they use those. Even in a game that's pretty bare bones like Lamentations of the Flame Princess, you will find some situations, where a target might have cover, where they give you some modifiers for that. When they give you some modifiers for attacking somebody from behind, where low light or being blind or the attacker's invisible or whatever it happens to be. And you start to get this idea of, when a modifier is used in the game, about how powerful is it. And then, from that point, at least it's been in my experience, you can kind of figure out for yourself, okay, well, in this particular situation where somebody's got the high ground here, what kind of advantage or disadvantage should I give them at that point? And you're able to work it out based on those clues, based on how the game, when it is codified, figures these things out. And also based on really wrapping your head around, well, just how powerful this is. And I've definitely made some mistakes in the past. Nobody died. Well, maybe some characters died. But you get the idea. And you figure out through trial and error pretty fast, in my experience, how to adjudicate that. And, it's just a preference-based thing, or preference statement. I tend to like that where the game is a little bit looser and doesn't give you a modifier for everything, but gives you enough of a framework where then you can figure out for yourself. That way the text doesn't become incredibly exhaustive. I remember trying to do an OSR hack at one point, probably back in 2011 or so, and I wanted to, just a lot of things that I found neat from various different game systems and whatnot. And so I started to make up this character sheet, or this list of modifiers I might put on a character sheet, or an attack matrix sheet, or whatever the heck I was calling it. And it instantly became gigantic, and I realized after putting it down for a while and looking at it a couple of years later that was way too big, and I really just needed a few examples of what a plus or plus 4 might look like, or what would you use for a plus 2, or whatever happened to be in those particular dice rolls. But you get the basic idea. So that's pretty much how I approach situational modifiers. It's one of the first things I do when I look at a new game. I remember having discussions with Francois Letard about things like 2D6, Star Wars, the D6 system or the D6 system, and when I started looking at Ubiquity, that was one of the first things I started thinking about, started talking about was like, well, how do I adjudicate things here? And just wrapping my head around, making calls on the fly for situational and tactical modifiers. So, what's your experience with that been? I'd like to hear it.